So, I know this idea seems a bit far-fetched. I mean, Mark Grayson or Invincible's training from the very beginning kind of seems way out of the ordinary, especially when we're dealing with a little kid, right? For a lot of the time, he is a kid or a young teen, so getting him to train, which obviously we know was very difficult. I mean, he didn't want to train in the first place when Cecil brought it up, but getting him to train earlier on wouldn't be the easiest thing in the world. But I will say, to an extent, it kind of makes sense. Now, the reasons why I believe this makes sense is, well, for starters, his father is a Viltromite. Yes, they don't know he's a Viltromite during this time, but they do know that he's an alien. They do know that Mark has this potential and that he's supposed to get his powers sooner rather than later. So what if Mark decided, hey, you know what? Instead of saying like, oh, if I don't ever get my powers, I can be Duct Tape Man or something like that. What if he was like, you know what? I really want to get into martial arts. I really want to get into some sort of tactical training. Now, obviously, he wouldn't get into like hardcore conditioning and stuff like that right off the rip because he was just a kid, right? Even as a teen, it's not the best thing for you to do for your body and stuff like that. Now, obviously, his DNA could be different to the extent maybe it does help him, but they probably would avoid doing some hardcore lifting or heavy lifting or anything like that. But let's just start with like the basics, right? The basic idea would be getting Mark an ability during his kind of young teen years, thinking about how could he prepare himself when he possibly would get these powers. And maybe Nolan himself would even start him with some basic training, even just giving him some of the ideas that he's going to have to deal with once he gets his powers in the first place. Yes, there is a reality where he's like, well, I don't know if Mark's even going to get his powers anyways, but it doesn't hurt kind of telling him like, okay, so this is how your powers are going to work. This is how flight's going to work. This is how this or that is going to work. And then even put him in some sort of training regimen that would allow him to fight with hand-to-hand combat and various different things like that. So that is kind of how I believe Invincible training from the beginning would start. He would be training in aspects that make sense in terms of tactical training and martial arts, not like these big overarching crazy workouts that we see him do when he is kind of like fully grown and now has his powers. Now, how would this change the time and the events of Invincible? Because we are using the same idea that this version of Invincible is a good Invincible, right? That would be the version we definitely will still use. So we come up on him actually getting his powers for the first time. Now, for starters, this will help him be more prepared when he does get his powers when he's around 17-ish years old. He'd be far more prepared and far more in a place to actually learn how to utilize them than what he was in the first place at the very beginning. And then when Omni-Man does teach him other aspects and stuff like that, he would be able to pick up on them because it's already been drilled into him and the ideas already have been drilled into him from the very beginning. But how would he do within season 1? The two big things that he deals with, yes, there are other fights that he does partake in, like different invasions from an alien race that, you know, has time or time works way differently on their planet and stuff like that. But the two ones that I always bring up or always think about in the first season has to be the Omni-Man fight, and then before that, having obviously the fight with the one and only Battle Beast. Do any of these fights necessarily change? I don't think so. This isn't like your run-of-the-mill typical like sending Mark back in time where he understands what he should be doing, what he understands, how he should approach things and stuff like that. No, this is a Mark that doesn't know how his powers are going to necessarily work, just ideas of how they're going to work. Yes, the training in martial arts and stuff like that would help him massively in fights against Omni-Man and Battle Beast, but I could see at this point, he would be outclassed. Like, hands down, would be outclassed. But here's the thing. As we go toward the end of season 1, Omni-Man turns on them, leaves the planet, blah, 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 all that stuff. Once we get to the end of it, in Mark's mind, he's already thinking about what he needs to do to get stronger, faster, and better than his own father. And this is where kind of the idea of him training from the beginning kind of seeps its way through, because we start having a Mark that is more adept or adapted to kind of actually training, right? So he thinks that this is something he should be getting into, and seeing that he just lost to Omni-Man and is really the only defense force against Omni-Man in general, we could get a kind of training like scene far sooner, maybe even getting Cecil to help him early as season 2, right? So he would begin his serious training regimen at the beginning of season 2 and not the beginning of season 3. So doing so would kind of push him forward a lot earlier and allow him to be a lot better in that next season as well, and a lot stronger, faster, and all of the aspects that we know eventually happens to him because of how much stronger he got from the training of season 3. Now, let's just talk about early things that would help him, right? Because obviously I talked about how the two main fights are obviously Battle Beast and Omni-Man in season 1, and then we have our main fights in season 2 and season 3. But what are the other early mistakes that he could possibly avoid because of this training or training earlier on? Well, for one, I don't think he'd be that much more overconfident against different and or stronger foes. I mean, he would definitely know how to minimize collateral damage in fights a lot better, and his strategic mind would definitely have him kind of stray away from actually leaving himself with brutal injuries and stuff like that. He's not a stupid kid, right? He's not going to be an idiot in terms of the feats of the battlefield. He's actually going to be impactful in those fights, impactful to the point where he could probably stop a lot of the foes that eventually would pop up outside of your Battle Beast, Omni-Mans, and possibly other Viltromites. But I want to talk about that, or we're going to talk about that very, very soon. Now, obviously, the next big thing in season 2 is definitely the events for Mark to show off his new powers against Viltromites themselves. Now, that has to happen when he goes to the Thraxens planet. Yes, the Thraxens planet, where he finally meets up with Nolan or Omni-Man once again. And this is where you truly kind of start to see the fruits of the labor, or of his labor, in terms of Invincible. So this fight itself against Viltromites, when they're trying to basically protect the Thraxens planet, is a lot closer than you would think. Nolan initially, or in the original timeline, had to basically fully get Mark to lock in. And honestly, Omni-Man did kind of control a lot of the fights and had to really make up for the difference between Mark and these other Viltromites. But this time around, Mark is already pretty damn powerful. A lot more prepared in terms of fighting style and fighting skills. But once Nolan tells him to fully lock in, when he's like, you better lock in because you got to fight to kill because they're trying to kill you, it would literally allow him to enter a different state, a beast mode like state, man. Because it would be already insane to watch, and it was already insane to watch Invincible go head to head with these Viltromites by just Nolan telling him that he needs to lock in. And it would be even closer, or honestly way more on the side of Invincible than it was in the season 2 kind of arc that we watched Invincible go through. Shoot, he might even be pretty damn close to the level of Nolan at this point as well. Now, is that a bit of a long shot? Maybe, right? Maybe. It depends on how well and how much that training actually mattered to him and how much that training was put forth. Because at the end of the day, saying that, oh, someone started training from the beginning doesn't mean that they were training every day, all the time, and this and that. But I do believe that the training he had in season 3 would happen a lot sooner. So this would lead him to closing the gap with Nolan a lot quicker. So when he takes on the Viltromites, these Viltromites, with Nolan by his side, trying to protect the Thraxens planet, it would be a lot better of a fight. There's a solid chance they both are able to take down more Viltromites than normal, but with all the reinforcements that we saw potentially coming, they would still fall short. I mean, at the end of the day, they're not going to be strong enough to take on a ton of Viltromite. Like, they're not going to be able to take on all of these Viltromites and just win automatically. Of course not. That is illogical. But at the end of the day, they would be a lot more kind of prepared for this eventual evasion. But yes, the reinforcements would still get the best of them, and Nolan would still be taken, and Mark obviously would still be told that Earth needs to be ready for the rule of the Viltromite Empire. But I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, what about the next threat? The threat that a lot of us are probably thinking about as well, and that's with Anissa. Now, frankly, I would say, depending on how correct the analysis of Anissa was in Season 3, we could have a Mark or an Invincible here that actually outclasses or can at least fight on a very even footing with this Viltromite. And it's kind of crazy to think about, because if he did have the same training he did have in Season 3 that he had or now having in Season 2, he could potentially keep up or even beat Anissa in a fight. Now, does this change the fact that Conquest and these other Invincibles and all this other BS is still going to happen? Of course not. But if he's able to defeat her, and I truly believe that this fight right here is a far closer one, and Anissa might just have to take things a lot more serious when coming down to basically tell him, like, you better get this planet ready or I'm going to send somebody far worse than me. I mean, at the end of the day, we know that she means business to an extent. So if she means even more business, this fight could be a crazy one. But there's no guarantee that he's going to be stronger or more prepared to take her down. But there's always a chance that early bits of training, that early bits of combat and kind of martial arts and fight training and all this other, other stuff like tactical training was able to help him massively get into a fight and potentially win a fight with someone like Anissa. And maybe with some help from Cecil and other people, Anissa might fall right here and right now, but obviously there would be casualties. There would be issues. There always will be issues and casualties in a fight like this. But let's just say, for the sake of what's happening, we could either look at it like she's either going to win or lose, or kind of be captured / just allowed to leave. Now, if she does leave, or if she does die, there is literally no difference on what's going to occur. And some people might say, well, why is that the case? Now, the reason why I believe this to be the case is the fact that no matter what, the message is going to be sent. If Anissa shows up where the Viltromites are, at the Viltromite prison, wherever you want to say it, if she shows up there and tells them, like, hey, Earth's not listening, send Conquest, right? If she does that, that is the same kind of message she's sending if she doesn't come off Earth in the first place. Like, if she is either captured, detained entirely, or, well, killed, we all know that message is sent no matter what. And it's not a actual message for say, right? She said no matter what, that there is going to be someone stronger than her that is going to arrive. So if she doesn't show up, well, the mission's still the same. The conquest is still the same. So the eventual arrival of Conquest would still definitely ensue. And there's a high chance that we could actually see Mark defeating her. But honestly, according to Conquest, she kind of is like this mediator who comes in and tells those resisting that the Viltromites could turn this into a utopia. So there is a chance that she could end up leaving without a massive fight with Mark. Maybe Cecil even commands this, kind of says like, hey, we don't want a big fight. We don't want a massive spectacle. We don't want people being injured or killed. So obviously it would lead to them deciding, hey, let's not fight, let's not do this. But we probably would get a little bit of a scrap, and Anissa could tell pretty quick that Mark is far stronger than what anyone else expected, right? And yes, you could take it either way in terms of does she live, does she die? Honestly, doesn't necessarily matter to an extent. But this would obviously lead us into Angstrom Levy, and this is pretty self-explanatory, right? A more prepared Mark might handle the fight even better, probably still losing control, but dealing with the issue far better. But obviously the real changes that we could possibly see is potentially a second training session, right? A second big training session. Yes, they did all this other stuff, but I'm sure after a long period of time, which we know these are long periods of time, we might potentially get a better training session and one that has a higher yield than you could expect. Now, you could argue that they might get diminishing returns due to the fact that when he started training for one earlier in the first place, but he would still have the benefits no matter what of the original training he would have gotten, right? Now, with this said, we already have him starting with a kind of a 60% or 65% boost in speed, 70% boost in endurance, and 138% boost in strength. So obviously this happened in 90 days, but do these boosts happen again? Probably not, but you could say that these boosts could be cut in half, right? You can get half of 65, half of 70, half of 138, and that still would be potentially a large boost preparing Mark for whatever is to come, which obviously would be the Invincible War and the eventual arrival of Conquest, right? These are the things that would massively help him and prepare him for these fights that they had no idea in the first place would even happen, in which I'm gonna be honest, even before the Invincible War and the whole arrival of the Fruity Conquest, we would see kind of Cecil's plan to neutralize him not go as well as it even did in the first place, because it didn't go amazing in the first place when he actually did it, but at the same time it had a lot more of effect. But this Mark is a lot more prepared, a lot more trained, and a lot stronger, so it could be even weaker than normal. Now, we got to talk about, well, briefly, though, as we continue on into the Invincible War and obviously Conquest. We all know, and it's pretty self-explanatory now, that preparation, all the preparation he did before this, prepares him way more for the Invincible War and way more for Conquest. Does it make it so the Conquest fight is easy peasy and he can go head-to-head one-on-one? Of course not. That's not a reality that we live in, but the Invincible War, I believe, he would be able to take on 2 different Marks very easily, maybe even 3 to 4 by himself. Like, I honestly, truly believe that this version of Invincible would be that much stronger than almost every single Invincible in that war. And it would be insanity to see how much stronger he is compared to them, even while, let's be honest, holding back. Because these other Marks, they go for the kill. They go to end you as soon as he possibly can. And the real thing we got to talk about, obviously, is the eventual arrival of Conquest. And I don't think this Conquest fights would change that much. Yes, would he be more prepared? Of course, right? Of course he'd be more prepared, but it also might make it so Conquest turns it up to 11 a lot quicker. So the fight kind of peaks out a lot quicker than you'd think, not giving Mark the chance to really ease his way into things in terms of fighting. But I do believe with all the help with, Adam Eve and other things going on, I could see the Conquest fight going exactly the same or at least better for Mark. There's no way around it. It's not like this is going to be worse because he's been preparing earlier on. It just doesn't really make sense, right? It doesn't make sense for him to be any worse than you could think. Now, with all that said, we all know that Mark had his responsibilities. We all know that if he started taking his training and his hero responsibilities like really, really serious, even when he just became a hero, you most likely would have had a far more prepared version of Mark. But I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily that he didn't kind of think this way off the rip. At the end of the day, he's a person, and at the end of the day, he was somebody who didn't necessarily want to give up the life of going to school and doing this and having friends and stuff like that. And he eventually had to make the sacrifice. He's just a teen kid, right? He's a teenager. You can't expect a teenager to understand the responsibilities that he was eventually going to have. And that's what makes this Invincible What If, in my opinion, so interesting. because this kind of doesn't just bring the idea of him training earlier, it brings the idea of him being far more responsible and understanding as a teenager, by the way, his responsibilities to the extent of trying to save the world. Now, I'm not saying this to blame Mark and say, oh, he should have been more responsible and this and that. It's kind of just a hypothetical with how things would change and how things would go if Invincible or Mark Grayson did start training from the beginning, or at least training far earlier. But I would love to hear what you guys have to say about the topic. How do you think things would go if Invincible or Mark Grayson started training far earlier or from the beginning itself? Do you think that he'd be able to take on Battle Beast or take on, Nolan and other people? Is there any kind of fights that you believe he would be far more prepared for than normal, to the point where he would actually win or kind of get the leg up on him so massively that we would see a different version of Mark? Or do you think him training earlier on from the beginning could turn him into an evil version of Mark Grayson? We have seen many versions of evil Invincibles, obviously, so you never know, right? You never know in these hypotheticals. I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comment section below. I would love to, read what you guys think about him training earlier on. Now, with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, leave a sub, and leave a comment down below. All that good stuff. And if you enjoyed this video, YouTube believes you'll enjoy this one, so might as well go check it out.